Okay, had some technical difficulties, so we're starting a few minutes late, so please join us in the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call, please.
Note for the record that all council members are present.
Okay, we have one item on here, which is old business, which is consider adopting resolution number 2014-40, directing staff to forward draft 2015-2022 housing element to the California Department of Housing and Community Development. And with that, under subheading, we have a proposed agenda. So are there any changes, deletions, or additions to the proposed agenda, Ray?
Yeah, I'd like the request of the subcommittee, because it comes from them, that we make just one minor change,
Okay.
namely the item questions, clarifications come first before we start getting into basically, policy determinations.
So do you want to do that
If that makes any sense.
after staff report, or what? What's
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, it would be, sure, the staff report would be first.
Yeah, okay,
And
so,
then subcommittee discussion, and I was thinking that
so you want to,
unless they are going to present something, that's what I haven't heard yet. If this is just the order of things, then it would seem to me that this kind of the general sort of questions before we get into the policy issues would be kind of more ordinary.
so you want to move number 3 to number 2 and number 2 to number 3, is that,
Yeah, essentially.
asking the subcommittee okay with that?
The one thing that the reason I had, recommended that we do subcommittee discussion, and I guess it really wasn't a discussion, it was more that I wanted to share what we had discussed,
Okay.
the topics that we had touched on in our subcommittee, and then move on from there. But if you'd rather...
No,
Okay.
if it's a
That makes
report
sense.
from the subcommittee, then that's fine with me.
I think it's more of a
I
report.
think when you use the term discussion, that's what kind of threw me off.
Okay, and I apologize, but
But if you mean subcommittee report, absolutely, that should go
yes,
first.
yeah, what we
Okay.
discussed,
That's good.
basically in our,
That's fine. I have no problem.
they were the items that we
Okay.
discussed in our
Okay, got it.
So,
committee.
so at this point then, no changes to that. Are there any other suggestions? Anybody have anything?
So we'll change that to subcommittee report.
Yeah, yeah, we'll stay, we'll keep it in situ, so is any other change? All right, so, I would entertain an adoption of the proposed agenda.
Yeah, so move.
All right, do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, a motion is second, all in favor? Aye. Okay, we have an operating menu, so, first item up is staff report, so John.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Mayor, members of the council. Again, we did have a hearing on the draft housing element early in October of this year. It was referred off to a subcommittee, as you've already mentioned before. So the report's going to be kind of brief in two pieces. One, just a real brief recap of the October 2nd, some of the highlights from that. And then I'll do a quick recap of what some of the items that were discussed at the subcommittee meeting, and then the subcommittee members can obviously kind of jump onto that from there. So with that, again, the goal of tonight's, or the hearing process here, is to allow for the housing element draft to be submitted to HCD, which is, again, a necessary start of the adoption process. The purpose is not to adopt the housing element, at the end of tonight or the next meeting or whenever you choose to take action on this. It's not adoption, but rather allowing us to have a dialogue with HCD. Ultimately, their feedback and comments.
Just for the general record, would you spell out what HCD is?
Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the state agency that is by law obligated to review and certify housing elements prepared by local jurisdictions. So I'll be using that term, not a lot hopefully, but when I do refer to it, that's Housing and Community Development, State of California. So with that said, again, some of the purposes, a housing element is a mandatory element of the city's general plan. It's required to be updated periodically. Sherry, if you get the lights maybe, that'd be helpful. And again, the cycle we're talking about is for 2015 to 2022, or actually 2014 to 2022, an 8-year
Pulling these
cycle.
up on the screens here, or? Sorry. More technical stuff.
Difficulties.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ray, I don't think your monitor,
Yeah, mine's blank.
your monitor's probably not on.
Hit the button.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All righty.
And again, the deadline adoption is the end of January of this year. There was some discussion about, is that the final deadline, or is there some extensions? And the city attorney will be able to provide you some updates as to, the statutory obligations and requirements of the city for adoption, at the end of my presentation. So, and again, there are some compliance implications, one being there's funding eligibility at stake from One Bay Area Grants, which is MTC sponsored program, and the other probably more,
It's probably ABAG, right?
no, it's MTC.
No.
One Bay Area Grant is a grant.
One Bay Area grant?
Yes,
Is that
that's
the one plan?
One
That
Bay
was
Area.
ABAG.
I'm sorry?
I thought that was ABAG.
The actual transportation grant funding, OBAG, is sponsored through, is
MTC, yeah.
sponsored through MTC and actually run through MTC.
As I remember, we were at the ABAG General Assembly. It was quite a debate about whether to approve it or not.
Yeah, the One Bay Area Plan, that's
Right.
the region's sustainability plan.
Right.
The One Bay Area Grant Program is the transportation funding program that's a companion.
Oh, I
to the
see.
Two different
actual plan.
things.
Okay, so it's a companion to the one plan Bay Area.
Yeah,
Okay.
the plan being, you're right, they're both kind of an ABAG, MTC coordinated effort. One, ABAG has more of the planning responsibility to develop the plan, the sustainability plan required per SB 375, but the sort of enforcement in terms of transportation funding is implemented and administered through MTC.
Okay.
And that's what this program is, the OBAG program referenced. And then the other key component is the timing of when we have to redo this exercise. If we do certify and comply, then our obligation is to update this housing element on an 8-year cycle. If we fail, then we'll be back to a 4-year cycle. So that is another, I think, implication of our ability to comply with this.
Is that new, John?
Yes.
That is new, okay.
Yes. And again, the goal or the obligation under the state law is to plan for housing needs for all economic segments of the community's population, identification and analysis of existing and projected needs, and most importantly, the establishment of goals, policies, objectives, and programs for the preservation, improvement, and development of housing and implementation programs. So that's really fundamentally what this plan is about. Much as I know there's a lot of concern about the state's sort of involvement in this whole field, and the numbers being assigned to local jurisdictions and whatnot, and I think that's a difficult process. But some of these overall goals in terms of trying to provide, housing for all segments of our local community, I think is still a worthwhile goal, even if it is wrapped in, a bureaucratic maybe exercise. So, when we have a discussion, I would encourage everyone not to lose sight of the goal of this, is that really the community provide housing for all segments of its population, whether it be workforce housing or intergenerational housing or young people. There is really, I think, a community good and a value that comes with accommodating our future housing needs. And I know it's hard to, sometimes you lose sight of that when we get stuck talking about numbers and some very quantifiable objectives, but there are some good, and I think regionally, I think we're all aware that the Bay Area is impacted by housing shortfalls and housing demand, so I think that's an important element. Again, the background, I'm not going to get too much into that. So the key elements of the housing element this year, I would want to emphasize too that this element, the prior element for 2007 through 2014 was adopted in 2011, which is pretty late into the cycle. That was due primarily to a number of recession-based issues, and the state kept extending the deadline to adopt. And what it really means is that the state HCD reviewed our housing element basically 3.5 to 4 years ago. And the goal going into this preparation of this next housing element was that the state had already agreed to much of the policy language and the programs, and to the extent we could, we wanted to maintain that adopted housing element. And you'll see that most of what we did was a rollover from the previous adopted housing element. That was our goal, was to facilitate its adoption by keeping it, in a manner similar to what we know the state approved previously. And then there were the modifications needed to reflect changes in state law, demographic data, et cetera. The two primary changes that I'll touch on are, we had an obligation from our last RENA cycle, the 2007 to 2014, we had a shortfall of sites, and we had 401 sites were required. We had a shortfall in excess of 200 units, so we were obligated to accomplish a couple of rezonings to make up for that shortfall.
Would you explain
The RENA?
how we ended up with the shortfall? What's the historical dynamic of that?
Well, when we did the 2007 element, it was based primarily, every time the housing element's done, there's a certain methodology for how each jurisdiction receives its, what they call the RENA number, Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And that means that from the Bay Area region, there's an overall number that we get from the state regionally, that we have to provide so many housing units. And then it's up to ABAG to then assign each individual jurisdiction within the ABAG region their discrete allocation of units they're required to accommodate in the upcoming cycle. And for Brisbane, due to the methodology that ABAG used in the last cycle, which was based on jobs housing, it was very oriented toward a jobs housing balance and trying to balance those things. Brisbane being a jobs rich, housing poor relatively, when you think of the region, we received a higher housing needs allocation for that previous cycle, the 2007 cycle, than I think historically we had. And that was 400 units, 401 units, and which is almost a quarter of our housing stock today, or when this housing element was actually certified. So it was always a very heavy lift, and I think the council at the time frankly objected to those numbers. They thought they were unrealistic. Staff would absolutely agreed with that. It was an unrealistic number that, for any jurisdiction of our size to be burdened with. But nonetheless, that's what we ended up with. To come up, and so what you have to do is demonstrate that your zoning, your city zoning will accommodate the number of units that have been assigned your jurisdiction. And so, the 2007 element, it was identified that we did not have enough residential sites designated to meet that required allocation. And we were committed to rezoning two areas in the city. One was Southwest Bayshore, the area that's now a mixed use, and it was supposed to be rezoned to a completely residential district. And we commenced that exercise with the Planning Commission after the housing element was certified. And to actually, when you started looking at the sites and the physical topography of the area that was designated residential, lack of connectivity, lack of access, landform alteration impacts, the Planning Commission ultimately advised the council, made a recommendation to the council that that was not a feasible zoning solution. And that came probably to the council maybe 18 months ago, maybe not quite that long ago, where that recommendation was made by the Planning Commission. So that was one area. So we did, we started our due diligence, made a good faith effort to implement that zoning, but frankly, it was, from a planning standpoint, very, very difficult to actually implement without causing some major disruption of a very visible, sensitive hillside area, and also connectivity issues that were really problematic if your goal is to have a community where the neighborhoods tie together. Creating the kind of district we were talking about there would have just created sort of another enclave of Brisbane that was not very well connected to the remainder of the town. So that ultimately wasn't pursued. The other area that was proposed for rezoning in part of that element was the mixed use at 125 Valley Drive. And again, that started in a very different dynamic when that housing element was underway in 2007, 2008. The property owner, the teachers' retirement system, had demonstrated a very high level of interest in actually moving forward to rezone their property to mixed use. As the housing element proposed. Subsequent to the certification, they actually re-upped the lease with the current tenant for another 5 years. So again, there wasn't a lot of motivation on the part of the property owner to move forward with that particular effort. Also, the city, in that window 2 years ago, started looking at outside help resources to look at planning the whole entrance to the village, the Brisbane Village, 125 Valley, that southeasterly edge of Crocker Park. In terms of land use solutions, there was an AIA charrette that had been suggested that didn't come to fruition. We ultimately ended up going through the ULI process. And given where we were in the ULI, it was the city's determination not to move forward with starting a rezoning proposal for mixed use on that particular 125 Valley site until that process played out.
Urban Land Institute. Can we use the words for the acronym?
Yeah,
The
sorry
folks that are
about
watching.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, that what they call the Technical Assistance Report, or TAP report. So again, that pushed that rezoning proposal back behind the timing obligation that the city had to complete that rezoning as well. So that left us with a shortfall of sites from what we were obligated to do in part of that 2007 to 2014 housing element, plus the additional housing needs allocation we have for this upcoming cycle, 2014 through 22, which was 83 units. So again, I think there was a well-deserved and recognized adjustment in those RENA numbers from 401 to 83, but we still have to sort of reconcile with our previous obligation that the city did not accommodate. So what that left us with was a carryover of 210 units of the 401. So we needed to rezone 210, accommodate 210 units for carryover plus the 83. So leaves us with a target allocation requirement of 293. So that's our kind of the nut we have right now to cover our past issues and to meet our current RENA obligation. One of the issues that did come up at the last meeting, and was discussed by the subcommittee to some extent, was the idea of, well, if we have to have 293 units, the zoning, right? We need to have zoning for 293 units. By the time we finish this exercise, we end up with what they considered excess capacity, more than 293. Is that the number? Yeah, 293. So the question came, well, why are we why do we have more zoning capability than we have demand or to meet our state requirement? And it all stems from, under our current conditions, we have an excess of above moderate or market rate housing. Our current obligation for market rate housing is only 30 units. Currently, we have 123 market rate sites. So we have an excess of about 90 units in the market rate category. All the zoning that's being proposed to achieve our RENA number is intended to meet our very low, and moderate demands. So there's no proposal to rezone to add market rate housing, but we have a market rate surplus of sites. So that's where the surplus number of units comes from, is the existing market rate stock of units we have, and those occur some in central Brisbane, in the R1 and R2, some in the Southwest Bayshore, some in the Acres. So those are pre-existing lots that are already zoned residentially at some level. So that's where that excess capacity issue is, it comes from. But it's not on the base. It's not based on what we're proposing to be rezoned as part of this particular housing element cycle. So if there are any questions on that, I'm glad to kind of flesh that out now, or you can wait. But I know that was of concern at the last hearing. So.
Any clarifications right now?
I have one question. Because we didn't complete the rezoning to comply with our housing element that we submitted to the state for the prior group of cycle time, do we have any penalties from the state for not completing that?
I may defer to the city attorney as to sort of what the implications are of housing element compliance. I don't know if that's a bigger issue, or you want to take a crack at it right now?
Good evening, council members, Mr. Mayor. There is one implication that in order to fulfill the rezoning necessary for the shortfall, so the 210 out of the 293 units, you have the first year of the new compliance period to rezone for that portion, and that is certainly the lion's share of the rezoning that would need to happen. We will get in a little bit later, if you like, to talk about the deadline for submitting this, the final deadline for submitting this without penalty to the state. And there is a bit of a grace period there, but that grace period does not extend your period for rezoning as to the shortfall. You do have a little bit more time with the residual, the piece that isn't the shortfall. But in this case, because, again, the lion's share of the rezoning would have to go towards the shortfall, your period for getting that done is much shorter than it would otherwise have been.
Thank you.
Could I follow up? So if we don't, that's only about a year, right? Something like that.
It's the first year, yes,
Yeah.
the first year of the
So suppose, we're bad boys and girls and we don't do it. What's the penalty?
That's a good question. I don't have that in front of me. That's something that I'm happy to provide the council, if the council would like that. But the deadline is to meet that requirement, and the requirement is supposed to be met within a year. I'm happy to provide that to the council a little later in the week.
Okay. Since we meet on Thursday, that's, we could, it's on the agenda again, I think, right?
Yeah.
So we can talk about that part too. But just to raise one thing in light of that, it's just sort of past history in my head somewhere. I recall that if you don't have certain things in place or don't follow certain things, we were told at some point that you are open to litigation. That somebody who wants to develop something and somebody said, oh, you can't develop that because you don't have an approved general plan housing element. Is that still the kind of thing that exists out there?
That is still out there. If you don't have things implemented, then you can't take the position that that there isn't appropriate zoning in order to approve it. I can put a little bit more meat on those bones for you later in the week.
Okay.
But you are in the position of then not being able, what you can't do is not adopt a zoning ordinance and then refuse to approve on the basis that you don't have a zoning ordinance.
Right.
And so at that point, a developer could take the position that if all of the other requirements are being met, that you can't approve on the basis that you haven't zoned for this use. It doesn't preclude you from denying for other legitimate reasons, but you can't deny on that ground.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Any other clarifications?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
Thank you. So going back to your, I think maybe it was your second slide, John, about MTC and the One Bay Area grant program. So, so funding eligibility, is that funding eligibility for a city, or is that the county?
No, that's for
Or the
individual cities within the county.
So if a city doesn't comply, then if we were to do a project where we wanted these funds or these grants,
You would not be
we would not be
eligible.
eligible. Okay. And then the other one was the 8 years. So every cycle is 8 years. Now, I thought that if you did it early, you got an extra year. And I think we talked about this at the last meeting, and for some reason in my head, I thought that you had mentioned that it was 11 years for the not having to put in for the next
Don't
cycle.
I wish?
That's what I thought too. So, but
No,
I
it's-
thought there was a bonus year.
No, I think it's more of a stick than a carrot. If you don't adopt, then you have to do it in 4 years.
Okay. Okay.
it's-
Just during.
My apologies if I've made that unclear. If you do not comply with the statutory deadlines, then you have to update your housing element in 4 years, not 8 years.
4 years. Okay. Okay. You're absolutely sure that there isn't a 1 year bonus that ABAG provided,
Yeah, John, didn't it used to be 7 years?
or was it
Used to be
7 years?
7.
Okay. So then.
Used to
Okay.
be
So then
7 years.
that is
Yeah,
a bonus
that's,
year then.
yeah, they changed the cycle to an 8-year cycle as opposed to a 7-year
Okay,
cycle.
yeah.
I'm sorry, that's just the normal.
So now 8 is going to be the normal.
Yeah, that is
not
the new
7.
normal.
Okay.
So that's where the 1 year comes in.
Yeah, okay. Well, the way that they had proposed it when we were doing the regional numbers, they said, yeah, you'll get this extra bonus year. But now you're saying that that's going to be the norm, is 8 years?
Yes.
Okay. That's it, Mr. Mayor.
So it is an extra bonus year in a way, but if you don't do it, then strike 4.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, well, I can move on. I think the,
Can I ask a question?
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So you said that for the shortfall, we have just 1 year to do those rezonings. So that would be by the end of 2015?
January 31st of 2016, I believe.
Okay. So what rezonings would those be under this draft? Would those be all or certain parts?
Well, I think practically and functionally, we'd want to move forward with this as a comprehensive program for all the sites.
Okay.
We probably, if we looked at this, probably the 210, we could probably accommodate in the Park Place properties, is that right?
180. and Park-
So we'd
Park
still,
Lane,
yeah,
so
we
we'd still have them all.
would need to do both the Park Lane and the Park Place properties to achieve our shortfall.
Okay. And I had asked a question by email about the properties that are market rate. You know, that there was a comment that from staff that, you know, those were not at issue. Those were not something that, you know, we were accommodating in the last cycle. And so that if there was rezoning, it would be downzoning those properties. And can you talk a little, perhaps the city attorney, about what the impact of rezoning would be and how that would work as to the market rate properties?
I take this one. Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Liu. The downsizing of zoning, which would be, in terms of a residential zone, would be moving from a higher density to somewhat of a lower density. And it's my understanding that that's being considered in order to eliminate the excess market rate units that the planning director was talking about earlier in his presentation. If you, in order to do that, there are some legal limitations on the kind of rezoning you would do. It would be, rezoning should take place with the zone as a whole for the most part, to avoid some of the type of legal challenges that could be brought by selectively zoning a zoning district. That may leave some of the already developed residential properties in non-conforming use, which means they can go ahead and use the property as it is, but there would be a limitation should the property be vacated for a period of over a year, that they would then essentially lose their non-conforming use rights in that situation. So there are some limitations on downzoning. Some of it is a little bit of a case-by-case case that we would have to look at in order to make sure that the city was on good footing should it do that. And as the planning director said, that analysis here doesn't impact the way the state would look at the numbers, in the sense that you're not getting credit for them, you're not getting any benefit in this process. And in some ways, the state may view it, since they do have some discretion here, a little bit that the city, rather than acting in good faith, perhaps is gaming the system a little bit. So there is another aspect to trying to reduce those numbers
just to
that you
make
might
the
want to
numbers
consider.
match. And you had said also that that it couldn't be like certain specific properties, it would have to be an entire district. So in central Brisbane, are there different residential, are there different districts? I'm looking at the map and it's not mentioned here on this map, but just what are the different residential districts in central Brisbane anyway?
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
So this is, John, if you want to back up a couple slides, that one with the two tables. So you have the Central Brisbane R1, R2, R3 districts, also the NCR02, which is essentially the first block of San Bruno Avenue and then running up Visitation Avenue. So those are Central Brisbane. Brisbane Acres, and then SCR01. So these would be all the districts that you could potentially look at. That's where all the existing capacity is, and the sites are scattered, I'd say, really throughout those districts. So it'd be a problematic
Right.
undertaking.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions
That it?
on this.
Any other questions?
No?
Proceed.
Okay. Again, moving on, this is just a graphic that shows some of the sites that are either proposed now or currently zoned and accommodate residential And the blue sites are all sites that the Planning Commission essentially reviewed and rejected for potential residential rezoning. Again, that would be the Village, VWR site, the hotel site out at Sierra Point. Certain sites, had been rejected previously, Levinson property and obviously the Southwest Bay Shore, so those weren't revisited at this particular point. And again, as we talked about, the Planning Commission recommended the sites in red for rezoning. The 3 parcels over here in Park Place to be residential only, and the 2 along Park Lane to be mixed use. So that was the Planning Commission recommendation. I know there was some discussion about that at the subcommittee meeting, and let's say there wasn't any particular consensus reached by the subcommittee. The subcommittee members can express their views on that, and I think that's reported in the little supplemental report I did. So that's kind of where the sites that were under consideration were identified as.
Right.
Maybe this is a appropriate time to, before you get to that, go back. There's some fairly clear reasons given for, the southern part of Southwest Bayshore not being maybe the best place. But I haven't heard any real strong substantive reasons for why they shifted from the property right behind the Brisbane Village to further back into the Park. I'd just like to hear the reasoning for that.
I think there were 2 things. One is that there's a certain limitation on the amount of mixed use you can, where your low and mod housing can be accommodated in a mixed use format versus how much has to be in R1 type, residential only, not R1, but residential only. And when you start kind of doing the math on that, it made sense, and these properties that were in common ownership, the 3 properties there, it made sense for them to be sorry, my pointer's kind of losing its steam. The 3 along Park Lane, those are the 3 that were designated as residential. And then if we had retained the 125 Valley site, we would have actually been, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we would have actually been providing more capacity than we were required to meet. Because if you notice, the 125 Valley site is actually larger than the alternative sites that we switched it to. So that was one issue, is again, being sensitive to not over-zoning was something we were cognizant of. The other thing was from a planning standpoint, if ultimately the city wants to plan the Village, 125 Valley, and those Park Place properties, in a more holistic manner, the fewer constraints we imposed on them to meet the housing element guidelines and law, we felt was advantageous to the city to maximize our flexibility. Because it might be that if you look at that area as a sub-district, then maybe you don't want mixed use in the middle of the Village and the Park Place properties. And the idea that somehow you're imposing that on that particular site, maybe you want your Bayshore frontage to have different land uses. So we felt it was really preserved the city's flexibility to a greater degree to plan that area more holistically and not sort of tying our hands behind our back with saying, okay, we need to have X many units to the acre and it has to be this and that. The city may choose to do mixed use there, but maybe it's a lower density, that it's not required to be a certain fixed density to meet state obligations because it makes sense. So again, that was the primary reason. It was really a planning reason that was converting, we just kind of shifted it over. And then if the larger rezonings weren't to happen, those two properties could be very discreetly developed on a standalone basis without then impacting the future redevelopment opportunities of 125 Valley and/or the village. We really felt that was, the village and 125 Valley really need to be looked at sort of holistically in the future, so.
Okay.
On a question on that, if I may, for us to do a change of zoning, does it require property owner approval?
No, it does not.
So originally you'd said that the 125 Valley Drive, the owners weren't keen on the idea to rezone it because they had a new tenant. So that wasn't a reason for us to not go ahead with the rezoning from the last unit.
That's absolutely correct. But what you potentially would lack is a motivated, willing partner who might pay for the planning needed to facilitate or implement that rezoning. And without sort of the guidance of any other sort of implementing document like the TAP report or anything. So and we'll be in that position theoretically no matter how we proceed. If the property owners aren't going to participate actively, the city will have to fund whatever sort of zoning effort has to occur. But certainly that was a consideration. As opposed to if they had been motivated and wanting to move that forward more rapidly, it's much more likely they would have been motivated to help fund the rezoning effort and the effort to put a form-based code in place, right? So that was, a resource issue to some extent.
Follow.
Right.
I got a million questions. This is I can see why Tim gets all involved in this. It's pretty interesting, actually. Because there's just so many variables here and so many possible combinations, and you start thinking about this and that and the other, and then there's this constraint and that constraint. So it gets pretty interesting when you're trying to, solve a problem, which is what we're really doing here. But I'm thinking about financial incentives for property owners. What are the financial incentives in reference to, any of the properties here in the Crocker Park, moving from, warehousing, let's say, to mixed use, moving from warehousing to residential, or low-density residential, high-density residential. Are there any real, financial incentives for them to do so? Are they going to be able to make a lot more dough by moving in that direction if the zoning changes so that they have more available options? What's the situation?
Well, as luck would have it, we have one of the major property owners out here of the Park Place properties, or Park Lane properties, excuse me. So they might speak to that. I think the question, at least what I think what staff's position is, that flexibility, this is going to be, the way we're structured is going to be driven by the market to actually implement any of these plans.
My question is a market question,
Yeah.
obviously.
Exactly. And what the city can do to create an environment that would be conducive to that change
Right.
is to have the planning done where somebody could actually implement what the city's already decided it wants, as opposed to leaving it kind of uncertain and for somebody to propose a residential project and maybe it'll get approved and maybe it won't. So I think certainty is certainly something that we can incentivize if that's the city's goal. But I think it also has the added benefit to the city of protecting what the city's interests are. Because once you take ownership from a proactive standpoint of what you want to see out there, then you're not sort of at the whims of the market driving, design. It's like someone understands what the city's desires and wants are, And if they can meet that bar and they make a project pencil, then they're going to come in and you have a deal.
Well, Ray, maybe if I could, Mr. Hagen, would you care to address that or not? I mean,
I'm happy to address that. It's pronounced Hogan.
yeah, Hogan, I'm sorry, yeah.
Hogan's Heroes.
There is no real direct financial incentive for us. We own the 3 properties on Park Lane,
Right.
us being DCT Industrial. The balance we've been trying to strike is what John's describing, which is if he outlines what is acceptable up front, then someone can come in later when the market demand drives it and fashion a project to meet those requirements. Our concern is that the requirements that are put on this property as residential allow a pure market movement. Because if you start restricting what we can do with the industrial property, which is what it is now, and that's the zoning, then what happens is you start limiting what we can do with the industrial property, which impairs its functionality, which translates into impaired value. And I don't think it really facilitates the residential housing very well, because now there's some question of why is the residential getting built? Is it a pure market demand, or is there some other incentive that's being sought after? There's a lot of credits that are get sold off in those types of developments, so it kind of muddies the water a little bit. So what we were hoping to do as an industrial owner and an industrial operator is to let the property run just exactly the way it runs now, and having the rezone go in the form of an overlay. So if a residential operator wanted to come in and do residential, it would be pure economics. It would be pure demand driven, and they would obviously have their own economics that we may or may not see. An example again is the credits. But to entice me to sell a piece of property to a residential developer, it would need to be compelling for me, as opposed to having it be an industrial piece of property.
Right. It's a functioning property for you now, and so they'd have to give you enough to make it worth, considering whether it makes any sense.
Yeah, and as you guys all know, everything cycles.
Right.
So the value of those properties have been higher than they are today, and they've been lower than they are today. So the best we can do as operators is just keep them full. And the best way to keep them full is to allow all the uses that are under the current zoning to continue to be allowed. When you start restricting those uses, you run the risk of having empty buildings.
Making it more difficult for
Yeah.
tenants, yeah.
Yeah, and it's already tough. Brisbane is got a lot of really strong attributes to it in terms of the business park that's here, the mature landscaping, the cleanliness of the park. I think the buildings are all nicely designed. If you go to South San Francisco as an example, that's a contrast to that. The negative maybe in Brisbane is accessibility. It's not the easiest place to get to from the freeway, so it's not necessarily everybody's first choice if that's their objective. It is people's choice if they want the aesthetics, because I think it does provide a good aesthetic. So we struggle with those combination of things all the time. Give you an example, 280 Valley has been empty for 2 years. We have a lease signed on it now, and there's one condition on it that could possibly it could fall out of contract, but I don't think it will. So that's good news. So that's the last building I thought would be empty for 2 years. So you just don't know.
Right.
So the best that we could hope for as owners is that whatever planning does during the rezone process or through the rezone process is to let the industrial function freely, which is the way it is now, and which is the way planning has this organized for the overlay, and let the market do its thing. And so obviously location is going to be important for that, and the connectivity to the downtown is important, and that's why I think, and I don't want to put words into John's mouth or staff's mouth, but it seems that saving certain pieces for certain mixed use versus pure residential, I mean, I think that all makes sense. Because the market's going to the market will craft that And so the zoning basically puts fences on it. So hopefully, I know it's a long answer, but did it answer your question?
Think through what we have to deal with here. Is that property that used to be occupied by Champion? That's sort of the biggest building, it looks like, in that.
145?
Three.
Yeah, did you say Champion?
Yeah, is
Yep.
that occupied now or
It is now empty.
empty?
It's been empty since Champion moved out, and that's not totally true. We had an internet retailer move in right after Champion, and stayed for a little while, and then found he's very cost conscious, so he will hop from building to building depending on cost, and so he moved out. We tried to keep him, but he moved out, which is fine. So now what we have is an event planning company going back in, which I think is a better use anyway. So they've been meeting with staff, and we're actually doing drawings to do their tenant improvements. So it's leased, but it is empty. It'll be occupied
take the whole
probably by
building?
February. It did take the whole building.
That's a pretty good sized building.
Yeah, it's 58,000 feet. Yeah, it's a nice sized building. It's a nice building, as the buildings go.
Okay, thank you.
So just one more thing on that. All of the buildings on Park are full now with this lease.
Yeah, I could see the others. You could see them from the street, but
Yeah.
the one back in the corner, you can't be sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So I have a question just based on what he,
Yeah, I like that.
Oh, you want to,
just to tag on that. So
Mr. Hogan, yeah.
can staff
Other
clarify?
members of the council have questions, so.
Oh, not for him, but to staff based on what he
Oh, for
said.
staff, okay.
Yeah. No, you can sit down.
You can sit down.
Relax.
You can sit in the front row.
So it sounded like he was saying that he's more comfortable with the overlay than, the strict rezoning, but if I recall correctly, this draft housing element doesn't propose rezoning, but to put the overlay on it to provide incentives that it will go. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it's not actually rezoning any properties, it's just the affordable housing overlay?
Adding an overlay for, yes.
okay, so, yeah, and just to clarify, if we allocate these properties, that doesn't mean that the current use is nullified. They can continue to do that.
Right.
They can continue to make improvements to their property. It's just, again, seeing if the incentive is enticing to have the property owner, perhaps change the use. Is Stuart going to be here tonight? Because he was going to provide some kind of financial information about, what the city would potentially make if the property owners decided to change.
Actually,
Doesn't look
We
like.
have a spreadsheet
that information may not have been, was that disseminated to everybody, Clay?
While you're searching
the
for that,
sub-
John, okay, I got one question here now. Now that we're having all these questions.
You sent it to the subcommittee.
I got it, and I couldn't print it because it's too big
can make a
of
copy of
Excel spreadsheet to print.
Okay,
You're welcome to borrow mine if you'd like to make a copy.
John, well, he's doing that, would this make the current use non-conforming in any way?
No.
Okay. That's all I wanted to know. Okay, so,
I'm going to make just one observation.
yeah,
An overlay still is a rezoning, isn't it? It's an overlay rezoning.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not a substituting,
Right.
it's not replacing the current zoning,
But it is a different zone.
it is, yes,
Okay.
yes. It's kind of an either or. You can either operate it under its current zoning, or you can utilize the overlay, and, yes.
okay. Do we have any more questions while we're getting that other information? That's something we can bring up under clarifications, right? Okay. So maybe turn it over to the subcommittee unless, John, are you finished, or?
I'm just real
You're halfway
quickly-
through, okay.
I'm
Go
most
ahead,
of the way
continue.
through. I'm most of the way through.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm doing the subcommittee.
Yes.
Yeah. report.
And I think in the little supplemental report, the issues that we touched on were excess housing capacity. I already discussed that. Mixed uses versus residential to meet the RENA. We talked about that. The other issue that we didn't mention again was secondary dwelling units, considering that for the Ridge. It was the consensus of the subcommittee to strike that policy, and staff has no objection to that. That would be deletion of policy HB 1E. So we would support the deletion of that if that's the council's pleasure. And before I turn it over, the city attorney did have a chance to research council members Miller's question real time about the implications of not, and I'd like to turn it over to her for a quick response.
Thank you again, council members. I did have a chance to research the question that Councilmember Miller proposed, which was, what happens if the one-year deadline for rezoning the shortfall from the last period is not met? And if the timing is not met, the city is then precluded from disapproving a housing project or a permit for housing where the proposed location is on one of the sites that was supposed to be rezoned but was not. So it is limited to the actual locations that were identified as being areas to be rezoned, but the rezoning never occurred. The city cannot.
Would it be from the previous housing element or from the new housing element?
It would be, so you had asked what happens if you don't meet that one-year deadline.
Right.
And if you don't meet the deadline, that's what happens. You cannot refuse it if it otherwise complies with all applicable zoning requirements. This, again, it isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still have to comply with the city's other requirements, but the city cannot impose a discretionary requirement on it or a conditional use permit that would essentially make it such that the housing development could not happen. So essentially what happens here, if you fail to zone, essentially the state is saying that we're going to go ahead and zone it for you as a practical matter.
But my question just has to do with which sites are affected in that way, because the previous housing element, which was not implemented, was the southwest southern, and also some of the sites in Crocker were actually different. And so the new housing element is proposing to delete the southern southwest Bayshore and to change the sites that would be considered for housing in the Crocker Park. So if we don't meet the year zoning, we don't do anything, then what sites are the ones that developers would have the right to build in regardless, as long as they meet other requirements?
It would be based on the 2015 to 2022 element.
Would be the new one, not the
Yes,
old one.
not the old one.
Okay.
But wouldn't that mean that currently, because we never rezoned for the last element, that currently those parcels that the zoning didn't take place on are subject to that same policy?
I'll let the attorney answer it, but I believe that since the statute actually gives the city, even if we hadn't changed the sites, right, and we kept the sites, the statute gave us an extra year from certification. So whether or not we was the old site or the new site, the statute still provided for that grace period, is my read of the statute. So we're not out of compliance until that year comes and goes. Then we're out of compliance. As of now, the state's given us a grace period. We're in the grace period today.
Okay. That's all you have? Okay, let's turn it over to the subcommittee then, and what hasn't been covered on here?
Mr. Mayor, if you may, there was just one more question that staff had asked me to address with respect to timing, and that is, there is a built-in grace period, a different grace period than the planning director was just talking about. The deadline of January 31st is the statutory deadline for having a certified housing element approved. The state builds in a 120-day, what is essentially a grace period for doing that. So you would have, if you needed additional time, an additional 120 days from the 31st of January, which is just about 4 months. The implication of there is no penalty if you decide to go ahead with that 4-month extension. If you then do not meet that extension, so you then are now outside of that 120 days, that is when the penalty is imposed, that rather than being on an 8-year cycle, you're now on a 4-year cycle. And those 4-year cycles are not subject to the additional 120 days grace period. The point to note, however, is that if you take advantage of that 120-day grace period, the 4-month grace period, the grace does not extend the 1 year in which you need to rezone for the shortfall from last year.
Previous element.
So you are essentially using up your time on the housing element, and then it's taking that same time away from implementing the housing element in the rezoning stage, if that makes sense. So as to the shortfall, you get the first year of the new cycle, but you don't get an extension to rezone if you use that 120-day grace period. So you're sort of, robbing Peter to pay Paul, perhaps, with that period. Is there any questions about how the timing
Yeah,
works?
But on the other hand, if you're using that grace period to rethink what it is you want to rezone, then it's not really wasted time per se. What you're really doing is giving further thought to how you want to do this, so that in effect you are moving toward a resolution of the issue of getting enough rezoned in order to meet the requirements for the total amount of RENA numbers.
Absolutely. You could do the processes at the same time.
Right.
But keeping your eye on the fact that once your 120 days is done and you've now certified the housing element, you need to do the rest of it, complete the zoning within the rest of that first year.
Rest of that year, yeah.
So,
Got it.
which is-
Then if you've made the decision, then it should be more easier to expedite.
Correct.
And that would that include having to resolve any form-based code issues that go along with the rezoning?
That would be to adopt the zoning in whatever form, if you want to have, based on a form-based code or a precise plan or a, district plan, yeah, that would be part and parcel to the rezoning effort.
Right.
Yeah, and that would take some time, because I would imagine that would take quite a bit of community involvement, and,
But you don't
residents
have to
and property
You
owners.
don't have to do form-based codes, though. I mean, that's one.
Well, no,
That's
but,
one way to go.
John, is talking about perhaps, doing a precise plan. And you might have a kind of a blended version of doing precise plan with form-based codes.
Good, yeah.
Right. So, I just wanted to talk about the deadline. So, I just want to be clear about the being able to capture the 8-year instead of the 4-year. So I thought it was January 31st, but Teresa, you're saying is that you have a grace period of 4 months after January 31st to still stay within the, to achieve the 8-year time period.
That is correct, you do. You have an extra 120 days that is built into the statute.
Okay, and then there's so we have this draft, we submit it to the state, then they come back to us in a certain time frame, and then we have to adopt it. So kind of explain that, John, because it doesn't sound like, you could wait all the way through and then submit it, and then, because you have to give the state some time, correct?
State has 60 days to review the draft element and respond back to the city. So that's yet another, so that would be within this, that's not extra to the grace period, that's within this
Within it, yeah.
120-day period. So even as of today, say if we submitted it, we'd be into the end of January theoretically before we got the state's, they'd have a legal right to not give us comments till mid-January. So even right now, we'd be very unlikely to meet the adoption schedule by January 31st.
So we probably have to go into a little bit of the grace period.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
So once it comes back from the state, then no substantial changes can be made, or would have to go through that process again?
We would have to go consult with the state again if there's going to be substantial changes.
Okay. That it?
So sort of our subcommittee report is a lot of the things that John has touched on that Lori and I discussed and commented on. We did speak with the Planning Commission quite a bit on what their vision and why they either looked at sites or didn't look at sites because they didn't feel they were appropriate for housing. And they spent quite a bit of time with us going over, it was Commissioner Lentz and Commissioner Parker who met with us and spent quite a bit of time going over their theories and reasonings and their vision for what they saw with this rezoning and with the housing allocations. I really appreciate all the commission's hard work at looking at things. But they did feel, I got the impression that they, were very much directed by staff on where housing could go and how we could achieve numbers. One of the things that the Planning Commission brought up to us was that the mixed-use area not necessarily would be mixed use of businesses and housing, but it could be work loft space or other kinds of uses that, while they have vision for them, I'm not sure how we would be able to really force the implementation of that type of space. And then the effect of mixed use zoning, we probably had a little bit of a discussion on and maybe didn't agree with necessarily in committee. My thought was that it may detract from other possible commercial spaces that are currently in use in the village, and from the possibility of the 125 Valley Drive site being more mixed use. So that was a concern of mine with mixed use. And the other thing that we had quite a bit of discussion on is the height requirements in the zoning, that it was a minimum of 3 stories. I've done quite a bit of driving around looking at housing and mixed use areas. I, drive around the Bay Area all day long, and, I've seen things that I like and seen things that I don't like. And so that was one of the concerns I had about being, a minimum height. that's written into this zoning. And, so Lori and I discussed that to a certain degree, and again, probably didn't come to a consensus. And then, as staff said, that we discussed the secondary units up at the Northeast Ridge. It sounds like it could be problematic with many different things that, besides just the design of the structures that weren't designed for making secondary units, but goes into the,
We're talking
Homeowners.
single family?
yes,
Single family.
goes into their issues that they may have with the HCP and with brain just went fading. The HCP and their CCNRs with their condo association or their homeowners association, and quite a bit of legalities that I think we decided we just didn't want to bite off at this time, because we didn't think it, so we came to somewhat of an agreement that we would leave that out of the comments to the state, because it wasn't something that was going to actually affect the zoning here. It was more of an aspirational type discussion. So, if you
So,
want
sure, I'll add to that.
to add to that.
Let's see. So, where should I start? So with the 3-story minimum, there was some discussion and different viewpoints about whether that was something we should keep in or take out. And, we talked about how, or planning had talked, the staff had talked about how, well, even if it's 3 feet, it doesn't necessarily have to look like cookie cutter and every other condo development in the area, that there's ways to use form-based codes and, design requirements that would make it more Brisbanean. So, the height itself didn't necessarily make it, just kind of a bland, boring development. That there may be, planning tools we can use to work with that height, to keep that density.
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
There's all this at the minimum, but what's the maximum?
No, they're, go ahead, Ken, you probably remember better.
Really, the maximum would be set through the future adoption of the zoning ordinance. The current maximum for Crocker Park is 50 feet, but I don't see that as being, that would be overshooting what's necessary for a 3-story building. What probably is more in the range of very reasonable is 35 feet.
And I asked about, how does 3 stories compare to, say, the, Crocker Park Trail, not Crocker, but the Quarry Road Trail, which is, behind it, and that seems like it would still be, like that road would still be above it. We wouldn't, be walking down Quarry Road and see this property hovering above us as we're heading, towards the mountain. So it would, because it's lower down. There's, a hillside there. And, for reference, there's the one San Bruno property, which is 3 stories. It's, the commercial space on bottom and then 2 stories of residential on top. So it would be similar to that height, not necessarily overpowering, kind of in line with other buildings in Brisbane. So I personally didn't have a problem with the 3 stories, but there was, there were some various viewpoints. And then as to the issue of, Terry had brought up the issue, well, why do we need to put mixed use on Park Place? Why not have that as just residential? As she mentioned, the concern that we have some businesses that may not be getting enough business. Why add to that, demand that is not yet met? And from my view, it seemed, what staff had said was that it increases the flexibility, to respond to the market. And there was an email that Terry had sent to staff asking some questions in the last day or so, and the response back from staff was that, the benefits to the city could be increased property tax and sales tax, business license fees, if there is some sort of mixed use. So, I see that there would be some added flexibility in having it as mixed-use residential and on that side, on the Park Place. And then as to the secondary dwelling units at the Ridge, we talked about how, where secondary dwelling units are used to satisfy some of the RENA numbers in other communities, like Hillsborough, for example, it's very different. It's not like the same building envelope. Like there, it may be, a larger lot size where they have areas that they can build another dwelling, and they can have, a lot of times it's people who work at the properties or nearby, and so it's like an in-law unit. And I live at the Ridge, and I can tell you that the houses up there are not like that. They're, there's really, they're built on hillsides. It would be very difficult, I would think, to add in even a separate entranceway with a separate kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom, which is what would be required. So it just didn't seem like feasible and really in line with that development, especially considering I had brought up there's some legal concerns that I had, which the city attorney has not looked into in detail, but, issues about, well, if the properties are made for additional housing, then is that going to be any problem with the HCP, which basically had said, you can have the housing, this sort of housing, and it was reduced in size, and it was allowed as an incidental take of the butterfly habitat, and that's how historically the HCP came to be about. So, it raises a whole host of issues which we didn't think were worth addressing at this point if the properties at the Ridge, at Landmark, weren't really, they couldn't be designed in a way that would make secondary dwelling units make sense. And I think that's about all that we discussed.
Okay.
Oh, and I had put in here discussion of housing policies and programs, because it wasn't something we talked about at the subcommittee level, but I remembered from my notes at our last council meeting where we discussed this, that Councilmember Miller in particular had expressed some concern over certain policies. Namely, there was one that said it was the city's responsibility to provide, different levels of affordable housing, and he questioned whether that was really a city responsibility and whether we should put it in the housing element as a policy, that it's our directive to do that. So I just thought it would be a good idea if anyone had any of the council members have any concerns about the policies, that we could go through those. And I did review them before I came as well. But that was the one that came to mind.
Council have any questions or clarifications from the subcommittee?
I have a question for the subcommittee. So, when you guys, were looking at the properties, did you discuss the potential, the upzoning, the value of the properties when, if they were to move forward with changing from trade commercial to housing, or trade commercial to mixed use?
Well, actually, I had asked staff to look into the tax revenue that's been historically received from the properties on Park Lane to see what would that mean if, we no longer had their tax revenue. And so that's the chart that I think we all have a copy of now, that I believe Stuart prepared. And perhaps staff can walk us through that. And that talks more about the the tax revenues lost rather than tax revenue gains, because we don't really know what properties may move in the future, more in terms of businesses.
Yes.
But we already know what's there.
Yeah, looking at the, just the property tax value, the assessed value, of course, there would be greater value. Is it enough greater value for a property owner to make the change? Who knows? I would assume that there should be some extra value, and and that that extra value might provide opportunities for the city to have community benefits by allowing the change to move forward. At our last meeting, we talked about maybe not doing mixed use on Park Place. But then, just thinking about it more, having a discussion with staff, and I think you mentioned it tonight, Terry, that the mixed use doesn't have to be a retail space, that the use could be a civic space, or some other type of commercial or non-retail or non-residential space that we haven't decided yet. By upzoning, when I was on the planning commission in dealing with the housing element and looking at these sites, we had proposed a 25% public space give to the city, but public space doesn't necessarily have to be what the community benefit should be. It could be perhaps having more affordable housing built into the units, like some real affordable housing. When we look at the different sites and we're talking about affordable housing, it's really, we're just we're really looking at density, and that the size of the units is dictating the affordability. We're not saying, okay, these units here are going to be strictly for this particular income, or these folks who might be homeless, or that type of designated affordable housing. We are looking really at just density, and so in a sense they're kind of market rate. So just seeing if that is something that you guys talked about. What other potential community benefits that could be had by moving forward with rezoning these areas.
Well, I don't think we talked about that specifically at the subcommittee meeting, but I agree with you that there's a lot more potential if it includes the mixed use, because it doesn't just have to be residential. And the recommendations that came out of the ULI TAP talked about really taking that space and making it like a civic center. So I can foresee, having maybe if we needed to relocate the library there, and to have like a civic plaza and have some public art and kind of integrate that with the new housing that we create, and then connecting that over to what may be at 125 Valley and the new and invigorated shopping center. So I think it just gives us more flexibility, and it's more, a long-term vision, to just look at it and say, our businesses aren't thriving, we don't need anything new, is just like kind of throwing in the towel and giving up. And, by having mixed use, I see it as more of a way to kind of think more broadly about how we can re-envision that whole area.
Mm-hmm. And also I was wondering, did you guys talk about accessibility to public transportation and just, trying to reduce the carbon footprint by allocating the housing units in this area as opposed to, somewhere else in Brisbane?
That did come up from the staff reports and from what the Planning Commission brought up as far as why they didn't want fragmented communities on the Southwest Bay Shore.
Right.
And or out at the marina, or some of the other areas that they discounted for not being part of the rezoning for housing. And I think more in my feeling, it was that they were more worried about the fragmentation and the keeping Brisbane as a consolidated, cohesive unit, more than the greenhouse gas considerations. But that was just sort of my take on it, that was more of a concern, but it's also very interchangeable. So they did look at other sites and what would be walkable or close to transportation.
Okay. And then, I was wondering if you guys also, like, kind of put on the visioning hat and, said, well, what, if, at one time Crocker was not part of Brisbane. It's part of the county. We didn't really have an opportunity to design Crocker. In a sense, it was, kind of like there was this border. Then, of course, the industrial park was incorporated into the city. I'm just kind of curious, like, what your take is on, do you think that the warehouses that are in the center of town are an appropriate use, or is, rethinking the center of our downtown to a more people-friendly, type of downtown, something that, that has mixed use and, looking at amenities and incorporating public transportation and, having access to recreation in the park. So, I mean, it was, when you guys were kind of looking at, what made sense, from a real, like a urban planner, community planning type of exercise, is that something you guys kind of talked amongst yourselves?
We didn't talk about that, but, in preparing for our subcommittee meeting, I went back and read through the history books about Brisbane and how Crocker Park came to be annexed and how the Northeast Ridge was built out and how that, interplayed, because we got the Northeast Ridge because we got Crocker, right? And when we got Crocker Park, what that made me come to appreciate rereading that history was that, if it weren't for Crocker Park and those businesses, we would never have a full-service city like we have today.
It wouldn't
So
be viable.
we can't take lightly the revenue that we receive from Crocker Park businesses. And that's why I asked staff to really look closely at what are we getting from Park Lane. Because, sure, it's great to have more affordable housing, but we don't want to throw away our tax base. So we need to be really circumspect about it.
Right.
But at the same time, having that information, now we can make the decision more wisely. And I think, given the housing needs that we have and seeing now that we do have Brisbane built into, the Ridge and Central Brisbane, this would be a way to connect those two even more. And I don't see a problem with expanding the residential in this discrete way.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah, just for now.
Clarifications? I mean, we got one person here, Mr. Hogan, for public comments, and I don't know if you want to say anything else. So, I mean, we can just kind of segue our comments into council discussion if you want, so as we go along, so. Ray?
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure how to proceed since I have a million things that are not clear to me. And I also have some different ideas as to how we might reconfigure this. I'm sure staff doesn't want to hear that, but maybe my colleagues don't either, but I've just been thinking, like we all have, and I'm thinking, well, maybe there's kind of a better way to do this than what's being proposed in light of what we're trying to achieve and all the other things. So it probably makes more sense to kind of get into the really big issues, which are where do we do the rezoning, rather than the million other questions I have, which are considerable, and also about all the policies and so forth. I think a lot of them are very problematic, as I mentioned a few of them last time. But maybe it's good to sort of get into, where do we want this rezoning to occur so that we can meet these state requirements? And I have sort of two sets of comments. One is, let's deal with sort of the configuration we're working with here. And two, I think we should think broader maybe for the next time around, because we're not going to totally redo the whole thing at this point. But so let's start with number one of that set of thoughts, and that is I kind of like the idea of the mixed use, though I think it's important that we be a little more careful about how we define what we mean by that and what's possible and what we maybe don't want. I think all along Old County Road, we should get as much mixed use in there as possible. And so I think that the property, right behind the Brisbane Village, which was in the previous housing element, should be mixed use. Maybe that means reducing some of what's over here in order to get the balance here. I'm aware of all these variables up here, but I like the idea of mixed use all alongside of Old County rather than putting it all just over on Park Place. And then we can, decide how we want to determine what the parameters are. I don't like the idea of this last building, one we were just talking about, that Champion used to be in, as residential. It's not really a very accessible location. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me at all. Maybe the first two make sense, because they are along an accessible street and they are fairly close to downtown. Maybe it makes sense to have this other building over here, not the court building, but the one next to it, to replace that. We'd have to look at all the square footages and numbers and so forth, but I'm just sort of thinking out loud as what makes more sense to me in terms of, if the housing and mixed use were to occur, where would it make the most sense to me, just within this set of parameters that we're dealing with, namely the immediate area around the park and the Brisbane Village and this southeast corner of the park. What I'm suggesting is actually quite consistent with the TAP report. That's sort of what they sort of were saying too, and so I actually find that recommendation of theirs as sensible.
If you're going to move on to something, I'd
No,
like
I was going
to
to say just one other thing about that,
Okay.
just a little history, and don't quit and
okay.
go back and forth.
Yeah.
The history thing, which is kind of interesting, you're talking about the history of Crocker and the location of the streets and so forth, and it is kind of interesting that one of the recommendations in the TAP report is to have Old County go out straight to Bayshore. Historically, that's the way it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And when Crocker came to town, they didn't want to fiddle with this bunch of hicks in Brisbane. They wanted to have their own entrance and, make it grand, their park, and designed by Lawrence Halpern and so forth. And so what they did, basically, the fact that we have this meandering Old County Road into town,
Shut us
thanks to
out.
Crocker. Because then we were all in the county, and they just went to the county and said, this is what we want to do, and the county said, oh, sure, whatever you want. So that's how we ended up with the meandering Old County Road. It's because Crocker wanted their direct entrance, and so they took away ours.
So how were the streets realigned?
Beg pardon?
How was it realigned previously? So Old County went all,
If you look at the
Used
map
to go
here,
straight out.
you just take, if you go down Visitation, that part of Old County by the post office, just go straight out. That's how it used to be. Which is exactly what they're proposing in the TAP report. I mean, ironically,
Wow.
they're talking about, bringing historical street locations back again. Now, whether that's a good idea or not, we can, discuss that, but I just wanted to point out that historically, the Crocker Park was quite separate, economically and politically, and also in terms of the rules and regulations, and they had their own special district, they had their own special law, the Guadalupe Valley Municipal Improvement District is a special law that they have for themselves. I mean, so it's quite an interesting history, and it was quite a battle to incorporate them, and I think the fact that we were able to do so in '83 is, I agree, Laurie, it's extremely important to the viability of the community. And we want to make sure that, we deal with it in a way that, doesn't shoot ourselves in the foot. I totally agree with that. And that's kind of why I'm sort of thinking through here, maybe we ought to, rethink some of this, because what was said before, I think, is something we really need to think about. Once you turn this in and the state says it's okay, you really can't, quote, substantially change it, unquote. So I think we want to make sure that what we put in is kind of really what we want to see happen over, the next 10 years or whatever. So I'm not, wedded to these ideas. I'm just bringing up thoughts and saying, well, what about this? What about that? Is this really the best way to go? I think we ought to have that kind of discussion, because we are kind of locking ourselves in. And before we do that, we should think carefully about what we're deciding to do.
So, the follow-up question I have for staff then is, so, as you were saying, John, when you can get credit for X amount of mixed-use units, but then there comes a point where you can do mixed use, you're not getting the credit. So, with these two properties on Park Place, how many more additional mixed-use units could we have and still get credited?
We'll have to do a little math here, and we may have a tool. We had put together a little spreadsheet to look at if you started moving units around and changing yields. For example, if you take 145 off the table, that's 75 residential units residential only units you would need to shift around somewhere. So
Right.
whether that's shifted to the Park Place properties, those don't, maybe if you increase the density, you could swap those out. But it becomes, we can do that kind of exercise on almost a parcel by parcel basis if that's useful.
I'm just trying to understand, what the, potential options are. When you look at 125 Valley Drive, it's a huge property. It's 4.5 acres. You're looking at, if you had 145 and 105 through 115 combined, they make up pretty much that size. And so, to say perhaps if 125 Valley Drive was going to be mixed use, because of its size, I would think that you'd have to, then there's a big chunk of units that would have to go to that property. If it was subdivided, then you could say, okay, yeah, now we could do mixed use in this one parcel and perhaps do housing in another parcel. So, but, I don't know if that's something that is easily done, or, is that a viable option?
Well, I think for now, you would designate that property for mixed use. I mean, that's what you would be doing. I'd have to talk to the city attorney. Split zoning on an individual parcel is really kind of a dicey proposition. You normally don't want to split zone and say, well, the first X many feet of a lot is zoned one way, and the X many feet that's normally not a really good practice. So you'd be putting that whole thing into mixed use, realistically. Then whether that certainly, we'd have to make everything else residential only, and then we'd have to look at what the densities, what numbers you'd have to get to achieve the 50% max. Ken, I might have Ken start noodling with some of this right now as the conversation moves forward. I'm going to kind of ask him to look at some of those things real time and see where we end up.
Sure. And then, the other question is, and I think it was brought up in the subcommittee's report. Maybe not. I think you did address about the excess housing capacity, but I just want to talk about the methodology. So that is used. So if we say we approved this, say, in the end, we decided to rezone these properties, and then as, during the year to get our ducks in a row with the zoning and perhaps come up with a precise plan, and we incorporated 125 Valley Drive, and we incorporated the village, that just because we might apply some mixed use to 125 Valley Drive, that doesn't mean that then the state is going to look at and say, hey, Brisbane can handle more units. That you get your units based upon a methodology that's applied to all cities in the state. It isn't, they don't single out a city and say, hey, you can, just because you zoned it, that means that you have to, we're going to give you these numbers, correct?
Yeah, I think it'll work the other way around. If you overzone, let's say you included some mixed use on 125 Valley today, and you got some additional units beyond your state requirement, you would basically credit those toward next cycles. This is your supply. You've increased your supply. They don't. That's normally how it works. They're not looking at, okay, you did this, so we're going to see what you have. And the methodology is much more, as you say, uniform across multiple jurisdictions. It's not that level of, if you think of how many, whatever, 89 or 90 some odd jurisdictions there are that are subject to this, HCD does not have the capacity or wherewithal to manually sort of go through that exercise and come up. One, they don't actually distribute units to individual cities. That's an A-bag function.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, fundamentally, the idea that if you were to overzone, to me, that's just you're good in the next housing cycle.
The next
you have
cycle.
more
Okay,
capacity
so
or more
we're not
supply.
putting ourselves in a position where, the state is going to come down on us and say, hey, you can do this, and so we're going to give you more units.
Do more, yeah.
Okay. All right, and I just wanted to put that out on the table just so that, as we're, just looking at, planning for the area, we keep that in mind.
So I have a question for you, Ray. So you said that rather than zoning 145 for the overlay, you'd like to see it at the one on Park Place next to the court property. Which one
Well, it
is?
would have to be both of those in order to
Both. Okay.
to match in terms of the acreage.
Oh, okay.
In other words, I would move the residential from 145 to the Park Place, and then I would make the area behind the Brisbane Village the mixed.
Mixed use. Just wanted to,
I think that comes pretty close to achieving what we need to.
okay. See, my take on 145 was that it wasn't isolated at all, and that having it as residential would be good because it would provide a buffer to Lippman, I think, isn't that where they had the
How do you
freight
get
forwarder?
there?
Well, if you go, kids could easily walk to school from there. It would be actually closer than the other
I'm
properties.
talking about vehicle access. There's no road back there.
Well, how do the cars get back there right
Way
now?
the
Isn't it
road-
from the corner
remember
where
how
it
you come
starts?
down here past Purcell Murray, and then you come down here, and then you turn around right there at the corner? And this building, just this part of the building is actually visible from the street. The rest of it is way back in there,
So where is the access to the vehicles?
right here. Well, then
Okay.
the access is just a loading dock. There's no street, really.
Yeah, but this
Okay.
is a building that.
So then
that's-
the other thing
So it
that,
could be a driveway.
the other potential problem, I was thinking if somebody would say, well, then we really want to get access on the old Quarry Road. And then that destroys the whole idea of the park quality of Old Quarry Road. So I was thinking about that too, because I'd want to protect that as a part of our park system.
When I look at that building, I mean, it definitely is like maxing out the space pretty well. Yeah, if this was going to be residential, you would demolish this building and replant it so that you'd have adequate access. So I mean, I wouldn't look at the building being the way it's configured right now. keeping us from visualizing it as accessible.
I'm just worried about what kind of access they would then want to have. And it would make perfect sense to me that they'd want to have access on Old Quarry Road.
But we'd have to allow that, and I don't think that's something that we would allow.
Yeah, I think there's,
Wouldn't, but it would make a lot of sense from some developer's point of view.
It's pretty steep.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a trail, and so
Well, yeah, sure, but, you can do anything if you want to put the. bulldozers
well, it would be
on
up to the city council to
So,
do that.
anyway, I
my.
just think
Oh,
that
well, all right, listen.
it's just not a really good location.
John?
just the other factor, and I think if these properties were in independent ownerships, I think there would have been a lot more of that concern about their ability to be developed independently. But I think it is important to realize they are all three under common ownership. And, frankly, my expectation is that a project along here would involve multiple parcels under common ownership, because I won't speak for the owner, but the idea of creating, one industrial next, I think there are issues as it is putting industrial across the street from residential. I don't know that it'd be beneficial for either party, if I were a buyer of residential property, to be locating it adjacent to an industrial use, or whether as a industrial landholder, I'd want to create that potential conflict on my direct adjoining property line. So, common ownership was another factor that we kind of took into account.
Terry, in regards to 145, where you at? That seems to be kind of a crux of at least looking at this.
Well, I had concerns and I asked staff a couple questions about the 3 parcels on this end, what would happen if 1 or 2 wanted to be developed as residential and not the third. And I received a comment back that they would need to be jointly scheduled for development, that there'd be something written into the zoning to make it where you couldn't single out one of these parcels, even though they're the same owners. I think that if we look at what Ray's commenting on and take out the 145 from the mix of housing areas and do the 125 Valley Drive as mixed use, we're going to have to go a lot denser and make Park Place and the first 2 parcels residential only, because otherwise too many units are going to be on the 125 mixed use and won't be able to be counted, because only 50%.
That was my suggestion, to make the 2 on the place residential.
Yeah, I don't think you were talking about 125 at all, did you?
No, not for residential. I was talking, that would be
For
mixed
mixed
use.
use.
Yeah,
But
you're
that would have
talking-
to be residential mixed use.
Well, part of mixed use would be residential. That's sort of,
That's
to
what-
me, that's kind of the
that's what it
definition of
is,
mixed
yeah.
use. You have some residential possibility.
right.
But
And-
you also have business and commercial and all the other stuff that Cliff was talking about.
And I think that makes more sense. I personally like coming in on Old County Road and having the curve around the park, and feel that makes it us rural instead of being just like every other mixed-use place that I see. And I hate to say it, I see more mixed use that I dislike than I like, as far as wanting to live there. If I had wanted to live in that kind of community, I wouldn't have picked Brisbane. So I'm worried about the mixed use along Old County Road being frontage on the entrance to our town. And I think that if the village or 125 is turned into more viable spaces, and I know that that's on the radar for some members of the council and the public, to make the village more of a usable space and something that was recommended in the initial ULI report. I don't really want to see it facing us particularly. I think it'd be better to be facing Bay Shore to try to capture that and keep it, keep some of our feel of being a residential community, because that's what we are. So I'm not sure if we can achieve it by reconfiguring it, but I'd certainly be fine with leaving 145 out of the rezone mix and including 125.
Okay. John?
So,
Sounds like, I got some questions here on this. It sounds like we kind of got a split here thus far on regards to 145, if I'm hearing everybody correctly. But Ray's suggestion, what does that do to the calculation? Because isn't that part of the calculation, having the two properties on Park Place at the 20 units per acre and mixed use? Because really, at least what I calculated, you gain, if you do it residential only, it would be 61 units versus 75. So it's minus 14. But you're taking away what was previously done. Is that, how does that all equate, I guess, is the question.
That was our sidebar. I'm going to spend
Yeah.
maybe still
Yeah, I figured.
2 minutes with Ken on making sure we're comfortable that all the numbers pencil. So I think certainly the configuration here, you could probably take 145 out of the equation, maybe change some of the mixed use and maybe mildly change some of the densities here and make these numbers work, but I need to spend a few minutes here before we're done with that, if that's, whether we do it maybe in a little break or after we have more questions.
You're talking about is the same calculation as what's on 105, 115, 91, and 99, the 26 units per acre?
Well, I'm saying, right now, the question I was talking to Ken about is, so if we're deleting 145 Valley from the equation, right, that's what we're talking about?
Right.
That's 75 units of pure residential we've lost.
Right.
So as you pointed out, Clark, if you converted those other Park Place properties to residential only, making a mild adjustment to the density, and then transfer the mixed use you had on the Park Place properties to Valley Drive, you probably end up to the good, or you end up a wash. You may be that you end up with more capacity, because actually, to get credit for Valley Drive, you're still going to have to be 20 units to the acre, and you may not need that entire property, but you don't want to split zone it. So you may end up having a little more capacity, than we currently have in this configuration. So that's my thumbnail tells me we'll have more capacity than we currently do.
All right.
And then, oh, I'm sorry.
I guess to get a more pure answer, probably give you the time to do that. I mean, I come up with 61 units. You were using the 26 per acre, but rounding off. Let's take 5 and staff do some
Yeah.
chit chat
Unless there are more questions, if you
on
want.
the record.
Well, as far as numbers, so I think you're also going to just see how many, where we are with the amount of mixed use units that we could still do. So right now we're looking at right now we got 48 units of mixed use. And what is the maximum that we could do and still get credit?
Yeah, well, that's part of the grind we'll do in the next few minutes.
so, not to add too much more into the mix, but what about the post office? That was kind of considered but not recommended by the planning commission, but that seems to me like could be a residential, because it's actually closer to all of central Brisbane. So could maybe staff talk a little bit about how that decision came about in the planning commission to not include the post office site? What were the considerations there?
I think it was twofold. One is the numbers. We could make the numbers work without it. Two is the post office was, considered a somewhat of a public use as opposed to, an industrial use. Whether that's right or wrong, or whether that's your perception of it is another story. But, I think that was part of it, is they looked at that as kind of being core function of a public downtown and a functional civic area.
And is the post office site owned by the post office?
It is not. It's privately owned.
There's, you folks there, DCT.
And that site would be considered mixed use because we have the post office use there, correct?
So
you couldn't-
how is it currently?
You couldn't count it as just purely residential if you developed the rest of the building of the site as residential.
Well, yeah, I mean,
not
that's,
zoned?
again, based on whether you would plan on allowing the building in its current configuration, or whether you're talking about redevelopment, whether it's residential or mixed use. And I think that was, again, not having to go there
Yeah,
as
yeah,
part of
you're
this
right. We have to-
housing element exercise.
Well, it could always be
Simplify
relocated.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we could relocate the post office.
Of course, we have to
And
have one.
That's, again, you go into a different area for sure. All right.
Sounds like we need a break.